Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm just going to ask you some questions. Have you ever heard someone say that poetry is useless? Have you ever felt that poems are only imagination and have no value in a real life? Today, we study poetry in universities, write exams on it, and even prepare for competitive examinations like NET. But there was a time when poetry was strongly attacked and seriously questioned. People said poetry was immoral. They said poetry was full of lies. They said poetry spoiled young minds. In such a situation, one man stood up and defended poetry with intelligence, logic, and passion. That man was Sir Philip Sidney. So, to protect poetry from its critics, Sidney wrote a famous critical essay called An Apology for Poetry, also known as The Defense of Poetry. So, friends, today we can study Sir Philip Sidney as a critic. The Defense of Poetry that all we know, this work is considered the foundation of English literary criticism. In today's lecture, I will explain who Sir Philip Sidney was, his life and major works, why an apology for poetry was written, what Sidney says about poetry, how he depended poetry. So everything I will teach you step by step. So let's begin with the life of Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born in the year 1554 in England. He belonged to a noble and respected family. From a very young age, Sidney received a strong classical education. He studied at Shrewsbury School and later at Oxford University, where he learned Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, history, and classical criticism. This education deeply influenced his thinking and writing. Sidney lived during the English Renaissance period when people believed in human potential, education, moral responsibility, artistic excellence. Because of this wide learning and talents, Sidney is described as a true Renaissance man. He was not only a writer but also a poet, a literary critic, a courtier, a soldier. Sidney was admired for his moral character, idealism, and sense of duty. Unfortunately, his life was very short. He died in 1586 at the age of just 31 after being wounded in a battle. Even though he lived a short life, his contribution to English literature is extremely important. Now, the major works of Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney wrote both creative works and critical prose. His major works include Astrophel and Stella. This is a famous sonnet sequence. It deals with the themes of love, desire, reason, and moral struggle. It played a major role in the development of English lyric poetry. Second one, Arcadia. This is a prose romance that combines love, adventure, politics, and moral lessons. It was very popular during the Elizabethan period. Third one, an apology for poetry that we are studying now. This is Sidney's most important critical work. It is not a poem or a story, but an argument in a defense of poetry. This is the work we study in literary criticism today. Why was an apology for poetry written? There is a question. To understand this work properly, we must understand the historical background. During the 16th century, England saw a rise of Puritan thinkers. The Puritans believed that art and entertainment were dangerous to morality. They strongly attacked poetry, drama, and music. One of the strongest attacks came from Stephen Gosson, who wrote a book called The School of Abuse. In this book, Gosson accused poetry of being false, immoral, corrupting to youth, a waste of time. He believed poetry distracted people from religion and discipline. Sir Philip Sidney strongly disagreed with these points. He believed poetry was not dangerous but useful and noble. So Sidney wrote an apology for poetry to answer the Puritan critics. Defend poetry logically, prove that poetry teaches moral values, show that poetry is essentially for human life. Thus, this work is a reply, a defense, and a justification of a poetry. Meaning of the word apology. Many students misunderstand the title. Here, the word apology does not mean saying sorry. In classical and Renaissance usage, apology means defense or reasoned argument. So, an apology for poetry, the defense of poetry. The both are same. Both titles mean the same thing. Sidney's concept of poetry. Sidney defines poetry as an art of imitation that teaches and delights. This idea comes from Aristotle, but Sidney gives it a moral purpose. Sidney compares poetry with history and philosophy. As we know already about Aristotle, Aristotle also talks about history and philosophy. Like him, Sidney also argued on history and philosophy also. History, according to him, history tells us what actually happened in the past. Philosophy gives us rules and abstract ideas about life. But poetry does something better. It uses stories and characters, appeals to emotions, makes moral lessons enjoyable. Sidney says that people learn better when they enjoy learning. Therefore, poetry is the best teacher of virtues. Teaching and delight that even he talks. Sidney strongly believes that poetry combines teaching, means moral instructions, delight, pleasure, and enjoyment. This combination makes poetry powerful and memorable. Poet as a creator, according to Philip Sidney. Sidney calls the poet a maker. Nature creates things as they are. The poet creates things as they should be. Therefore, poets creates ideal heroes and noble characters that inspires the readers. Poetry is not lying, that he depends it. Critics accused poetry of lying. Gosson, who accuses? Sidney replies clearly that a poet never claims that his story is a true. Therefore, the poet never lies. Poetry presents imaginary examples to guide real life. Now, the types of poetry. Sidney discusses different kinds and types of poetry, such as lyric poetry, pastoral poetry, tragedy, comedy, heroic poetry. He considers heroic poetry the highest form because it teaches courage, leadership, and virtue. Importance of an apology of poetry. What are the importance? This work is important because it is a first major work of English literary criticism. It depends poetry on moral grounds. It blends classical theory with Renaissance humanism. It influenced later English critics. It laid the foundation for studying literature seriously. Now, summary. I am just going to sum up everything with conclusion. Sir Philip Sidney, he is considered as a Renaissance poet and a critic, as we know. He wrote an apology for poetry around 1580, defended poetry against Puritan attacks, believed poetry teaches and delights, considered poetry morally superior to history and philosophy. So now I am just going to conclude it. Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry is not just a defense of poetry. It is defense of human imagination, moral, education, and art itself. Sidney proves that poetry is not a false, is not immoral, is not useless. Instead, poetry shapes character, inspires virtue, and enriches human life. That is why this essay is still studied today in universities and competitive examinations. It teaches us not only about poetry but also about the purpose of literature. So, students, if you think this video is useful, if you want more like this, like the video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with your friends. So, friend, thank you.